In August 1945, when the bomb was dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, it ended the Second World War. But when my mother strolled down a Sydney street in October of 1945, wearing nothing more than a skimpy two-piece French costume, she started a war that would last for another 20 years. When the war did end on August 15, 1945, Australians celebrated in the streets. But Australia then was full of wowders and moralists, and it was no place for celebrations for women like my mother, who had a thumbs-up attitude to the moral majority of the times. The only place females could wear a two-piece costume were at secluded beach areas. My mother was a real puzzle. I could never get a handle on her. She had a very strong personality which made her full of contradictions. I can remember when I was about 10 or 11, I used the Lord's name in vain, and she made me bow 3 times in front of a photo of Jesus and made me say, "I'm sorry." Well, then again, we were Irish Catholics, and I think there was some guilt in there, based on the fact that she was once labelled her moral herself.
Our movement is disgusted with this French bathing costume. My fellow delegates and I wish to see the civil authorities ban it. I am no prude, but this is past a joke. This open displays of the body lead to immorality. Isn't there some law against decency?
There's absolutely no need for clothes. People in the earliest civilization existed without them. Yesterday, a young woman in George Street wearing a French costume and looking like Eve in Eden caused a near riot. If it's true that women began the process of putting clothes on, well, it's now equally true they're taking them off. And it's only a matter of time before we're getting about in our natural state.
During World War II, women found new freedom. Thousands of jobs opened up for women, taking them out of their traditional roles in the kitchen and into the Women's Land Army. But my mother just wasn't the type to dress up in khaki. She was unusual and provocative for her times. My mother, as well as being a mannequin model, also performed as a showgirl at Sydney's famous Tivoli Theatre. Now I believe this was her feel-good contribution to the war effort. Elsewhere, other Tivoli showgirls performed in uniform at government war loan rallies. When World War II ended, women were still joining the workforce, but there was a new push to get them out of that workforce and swap their newfound freedom for motherhood. Women no longer had a public place. It was to return to the home. But my mother decided the public place was still for her. She no doubt loved to body, loved to model and dress like a movie star. Women began to question the right to display their bodies in public. But my mother was one of the very few women who dared to cross that moral boundary of the times.
Mr. Van Prague, I'm warning you to stop this exhibition. I find it offensive and you could be breaking the law. Warning you, you better bloody stop this exhibition.
Oh, go away, Van Prague. You're holding up the Naval Review.
I'm warning you, you better bloody stop this exhibition.
Va te faire foutre.
It's too late, Sergeant. I was staggered by the summons. Makes a man feel like a real heel. I've seen girls wear less in Tivoli shows.
I'm disgusted by the action of the police. The French costume I wore was like an overcoat compared to costumes I've worn in Tivoli shows.
Sergeant, can you tell the court what you witnessed at the Sydney Sports Ground on October the 27th this year?
When I saw Miss Nyland at the racetrack, all she was wearing was a V tied to the top of her hips, with a loop up to her pelvis and the V tied on each side of her hip bone.
Had she nothing on the top of her body at all?
She had on a pair of brassiers pulled together with a ribbon.
Can you describe to the court Miss Nyland's mannerisms?
Miss Nyland proceeded to lean backwards and tie the knots on her hip, and you could see her thighs.
Did you approach Miss Nyland after the exhibition?
Yes.
And she said?
I'm 23 years of age and I please myself what I do. And I bet you bloody enjoyed it.
Nothing, sir.
Miss Nyland, would you please show to the court the two costumes you are holding? Now, in your opinion, would the Tivoli costume contain less material than, say, the French costume?
Yes, it does.
And what costume were you wearing at the exhibition, Miss Nyland?
I was wearing this one, the French costume.
Now, could you please hold up the brassiere of the Tivoli costume? As your worship will see, the Tivoli costume is much more scant than the French costume. Sergeant Caldwell, do you ever go to the beaches?
I've been once this year.
And did you see any navals?
No,
Did you see any ultra-modern costumes?
not like Miss Nyland's. Hers was cut out like butterfly wings and had no legs.
Well, would you agree that a wet costume on a female would show the figure to more prominence than, say, a dry one?
If you're referring to Miss Nyland's costume, hers was offensive. Others are not.
How did you know about the exhibition, Sergeant Caldwell?
I had a program.
Well, I put it to you, Sergeant Caldwell, that you went there specifically for the purpose of looking at the costume.
Your Worship, I'm a promoter. It is not in me to stand up to embarrassment, public ridicule, where there's a question of cancelling an event that's due to be staged. And that's why I walked away from Sergeant Caldwell.
Lionel Van Prague, it is abundantly clear that you procured this offence, the commission of an indecent act, and you are guilty of aiding and abetting Miss Nyland in that commission. I fine you 10 shillings and order that you pay 8 shillings being court costs.
Your Worship, at a recent War Loan rally in Martin Place, girls paraded in French costumes. I mean, if it's good enough for the government, it should be good enough for me.
Patricia Margaret Nyland, you have been charged with indecent behaviour in wearing a French costume in a public place. I find the offence proved, and I fine you the sum of 5 shillings and 8 shillings being court costs.
This incident that occurred on that particular occasion with Pat Nyland was always a fairly prominent incident in his mind, and we used to talk about it a bit. It was basically trying to promote in a proper fashion a venue for the public, and he had the bikini girl there, and of course the local constabulary didn't really appreciate the situation, which they never really do, probably because they weren't invited. And he had problems, but of course, being the man I knew him as, fairly hot-headed guy, he stirred the police up a bit, and of course it ended up in a court case.
I've never seen a bathing costume in the Woy Woy Shire that has shocked me. I think the Ordnance Act governing bathing costumes should be brought up to date. However, females wearing the French costume have a right to appeal to me.
Despite my mother's court case ruling, sales of French costumes were as brisk as ever. Stores like Marc Foy's had to continually stock up, and so the story went on. After an atom bomb was exploded at Bikini Atoll in 1946, the French swimsuit got its new name because of the shape of the atoll. French fashion designer Louis Réard named his new two-piece costume the Bikini. For the next 20 years, men not only patrol the beaches, they also control what women should and should not wear. In 1949, my mother married Herbert Arthur Aston, a ground caretaker, and began raising us in the Sydney suburb of Top Ryde. The 1950s saw many social pressures put back on women in that their place was in the home and not in the workforce, and morals were questioned. My mother by then was no longer a model and wasn't having fun anymore. She was now a widow as a result of my father being involved in a fatal car accident in 1957. And I'm afraid the 1950s saw my mother finally go along with the times.
Sex before marriage was out.
Short dresses were out.
Mum didn't believe in sex before marriage, see-through blouses, short skirts, and I think mainly because she was trying to protect us because of the troubles that she had through her being a little bit risque.
With my three sisters, when we were growing up as teenagers in the 1960s, Mum was against them wearing short miniskirts, which was the fashion of the times. She thought these types of dresses were cheap and slutty, but at the same time, in a contradictory manner, she always said to them, never be ashamed of your bodies, and I've never forgot her saying that. Very odd indeed. My mother was, as a teenager, she often encouraged me to join the priesthood. She was a bit of a character. I always took this as light-hearted comedy, but she was serious on the priesthood bit. But I remember once she said, look son, ever feel like playing with yourself, just lay on a cold floor? And I went, Not long before my mother died, I asked her about a series of photos taken of her in the 1940s for Pertinent magazine. Oh, those photos, she simply said. I did them for art's sake. I found it hard to connect with my mother at times. It's funny how we cling to mothers when we're young, and when we're teenagers we become embarrassed by them. I know I did. These days, now she's gone, to connect with my mother, wherever she is, I just use my imagination, thanks to her.
Good night, Miss Nyland.